basically, how do you create an economy that actually values the environment? That's kind of what I was obsessed with. And I felt actually that the Greens at that period were all about very uneconomic ideas for environmental change.
Passionate about sport, politics, and especially climate change policy, Tommy Ricketts wanted more from his career in policy advisory at a major global bank. Whilst on a trip to Japan to watch his beloved New Zealand play in the Rugby World Cup, Tommy couldn't resist calling up his friend and soon-to-be business partner to talk about this business idea of setting up BeZero Carbon, a carbon net zero consultancy. Fast forward 4 years and they have now scaled to 150 staff, and they are really making a difference in this nascent industry as a global carbon ratings agency. We talk about his career in policy and banking, the cultural differences between the London and New York banking bubbles. We discuss greenwashing and how committed corporations really are to reducing carbon footprint. And we also talk about the use of technology and AI in the carbon net zero crusade, and his dream of making a documentary about sports referees, which I really like talking about, and so much more. It was a fascinating conversation. Very important industry that is growing exponentially. Great guy. This was a really good one. It's Tommy Ricketts. Tommy, thank you so much for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast. We haven't had a guest on in the space that you guys operate, so I'm really excited to unpack some of the amazing work you guys have been doing recently and the ridiculous growth you've experienced in the last 3 years, and so much more in terms of your background as well. So thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the immortal question we always ask at the beginning of the Tech Leaders podcast. What does good leadership mean to you?
I guess that's changed, actually. I think before I came to this, came to the position I'm in, I'm currently employ about 150 people. Good leadership meant my experience in playing years and years of competitive sport. It meant high energy, it meant being inspirational, it meant trying to galvanize people and be sort of, dynamic. But I think as you get more entrenched and entwined with the myriad personalities and backgrounds of people that you work with, I think actually it's more about listening. It's more about trying to be emotionally balanced so that you can encounter every situation on the same terms, which can be very difficult when you're stressed and you're working very hard. And the thing that I always tell managers at the company is try to be the boss that you wanted to have. What that meant to me was not clock watching, respecting that I'm always going to put in the extra shift. And if I wanted to leave early, that was my prerogative. But obviously more than that, and also just, trying to actually create a sense of momentum for people and feeling like they're being appreciated. So I think, good leadership to me now means much more sort of socio-cultural things as opposed to before, which was probably a bit more kind of competitive and personal.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant answer, by the way. Tell us a little bit about your sporting background then, Tommy.
So I am the youngest of 6 children and basically just wanted to run around chasing various shaped, balls in various different types of outfits for as long as I could, essentially. So I played a lot of rugby, football and cricket, swam a lot, did a lot of tennis. But I think cricket and football were really always my big things. And that's what I continue to play at only an amateur level, but religiously, you could ask if you asked any of my friends, up until really my daughter was born at the end of last year. And in the early days, I was very lucky. I got what's called an assisted place. So it meant a government scholarship to a private school in London, and was just very lucky to have kind of an amazing education, which had all those facilities and to benefit from those.
What did you want to be when you grew up then, Tommy? Why did you choose to do history of economics, and what did you want to do?
So my parents are academics. I was born in New Zealand and my parents divorced when I was about 4, and I moved to England with my mum, and my dad's an English professor. My mum has had various jobs, but is currently a kind of social historian, I guess. And genuinely, I only knew up until I left university, it sounds really stupid this, but that there were kind of 3 jobs. Either you were an academic, you were a doctor, or you're a lawyer. That's kind of it, basically. Honestly, it was a toss-up between geography and history. So it's economic history, which is a type of history. I actually started my degree during geography because what I loved was human geography, and then went to university and got very frustrated. And then I started doing the economic history modules, and it was like the history of British industries. It was the history of living standards in the working class. It basically changed my degree after the end of the first year, and then focused on basically lots of modern history, which applies very much to my worldview as I have now. I'm always using the theories that I learned from university and then onwards in politics and in finance. And it's really, this is for me the beginning of the new economy. And what does that economy look like? So having the perspective to go back 200-300 years at the different economic cycles is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you still use the sort of economic models and things that you learned at university then in your everyday running of the business, that because you operate in a very macroeconomic world now, don't you? So
my business partner is the better economist. He studied economics and then worked at the Bank of England. So I'd defer to him on my GDP modeling and stuff like that. Now,
yeah,
I used it more. So economics is two things. There's a lot of models, but the other one is basically a social science. And a lot of it is really about motivations, I think. And so, yes, in that sense, I think about it a lot, because in very simple terms, climate transition is about pricing an externality. That an externality is our impact on the environment.
Yeah.
And the brief history of climate change is that we haven't ever priced it into our economic activities. And that's why there's so much impact, and what people refer to as the Anthropocene, which is the human impact on the climate, which has basically kind of gone stratospheric since the 1950s, but it can date back to before that with the use of fossil fuels. And it's all basically a very simple economic problem, which is we don't price nature. And so yes, in that sense, I do very much use that sort of theory. But when it comes to the day-to-day models that we think about, and I'll come on to explain this, I say they're more informed by an element of financial risk as opposed to economic risk. In terms of that theory. And so I left university and went into politics. I spent 5 years working in what's called public affairs. Started my career with my godfather, actually, who was and is a big inspiration for me. He was technically the first ever elected Green politician in the state parliament in Hamburg in the 1970s for the Green Party. And he was one of the founders of the Green Party when the Green Party was really a big German student anti-nuclear movement, really. One of his most famous claims to fame was he was the first president of the Greens in the European Parliament. But he also did this protest, which has kind of led him to be somewhat exiled from Germany, where the nuclear general this is in the newspapers, by the way, the nuclear general from the American army came to visit the parliament. And as a activist, I think he was like 30, anti-nuclear campaigner, he basically drew the short straw through a bucket of pig's blood on the general. This is the general. This is the guy with the red button in the box, right?
Right.
And long story short, my actual thing was all about this, trying to take over the legacy of this guy that I massively revere called Frank Schwalbe-Huth and his sort of green agenda. And I spent a lot of my time interning with him over the various summers from when I was 15 all the way to when I was 23. And so actually came out of university desperate to work in politics, and then spent the next 4 or 5 years working in lots of infrastructure, energy and banking type policy. And then actually I was coming to the end of that period and I was like, look, basically the actions in financial markets, that's kind of where it all takes place. And actual central banks set a lot of economic policy these days anyway. And how do I get into that side? And by total chance, my boss in politics was leaving the place he'd been at, had previously spent 20 years at Deutsche Bank and at hedge funds. And he said to me, I'm going to be head of research for European equity strategy at Bank of America. And I genuinely didn't know what that sentence meant. I had no idea what that sentence meant. I didn't know what that job title meant. I didn't even know that. I just said to him one simple text, which basically changed my life, which was that, can I come with you? And he said, well, maybe, but you're 28. You haven't done maths since you were 16. You're going to have to do this thing called the Chartered Financial Analyst exams, the CFA. And I was like, fine. So I went and had my interviews at B of A, was hired as an associate. And then I remember turning up on my first day at the bank in March 2015, and they put me in, they logged me into this Bloomberg terminal. And I don't know if you've ever seen a Bloomberg terminal, but it's not a normal keyboard. And it's like, my boss didn't join for a month, and I just sat there watching the cricket. No idea what was going on. And then I had to do my financial exams at the time, my FCA exams. And so I sat there revising my FCA, and I think that summer there was lots of cricket on. There was New Zealand, there was the Ashes. Most of my time just basically not knowing what to do and having to learn. But then in that first year, I did which is, I don't advise to anyone. I did the CFA level 1 and the CFA level 2 back to back. So you can do this December and then June. And so I kind of put myself on this accelerated course to teach myself financial markets. And by the end of that first year, I was really kind of, I was back up to speed, basically. The only thing I was any good at was basically talking about and writing about political trends. So
yeah, sure.
That was very in vogue at the time. And so I spent a lot of time advising and writing up the implications, both financial and economic, of Brexit. And then was lucky enough to get moved to New York, where I worked with a guy called the global investment strategist, who's really the arch storyteller of the research department. And that led me to a point of just basically saying, having had an education in politics, having kind of felt like I spoke pretty fluent financial markets, it was now, and he said this to me, and he probably won't remember this, but he sort of rather pointedly called me a pop star without an album. He was basically trying to have a go at me and say I was like Billy Big Shoes, as a 31-year-old living this nice life in New York, but I hadn't done anything proper. Like, what was my actual body of work? What was my contribution? What was I really going to be known for, as opposed to writing the odd piece and getting sent to New York for a couple of years?
How did you end up in New York then? Can you tell us about that, Tommy?
I turned up to work one day, and my boss sent me an email, the head of the department, and said, "Can I meet you, this afternoon?" And I walked in, and he said, "We're moving you to New York." That was short of it.
I'm assuming you didn't argue or put up much resistance to that. Then it's not a bad place to be relocated, though, is it? I mean, I love New York personally, but
it wasn't. I remember when I turned up, I got asked a very good question by someone. So I turned up, I was just turned 30, and they said to me, "Is this the first time that you've ever lived away?" And obviously I went to university, I studied at Edinburgh, but you're with everyone, it's kind of still the UK. And that was true. So I actually turned up in New York as a 30-year-old where no one knew me, totally starting again in a job with a, nice, cushy, sort of like good job, but also with a very demanding boss. And actually it was kind of a bit of a new chapter, if you will, in the life. And it gave me a lot of perspective.
Yeah.
And it was finishing school, I think, really for me. It was finishing school socially, mentally, but also professionally and emotionally.
That's a good way to look at it. I mean, it's kind of, I worked in Toronto for a year myself. I grew up a lot there. Let me ask you this though, Tommy. What about the cultural difference between London and New York from a working financial services perspective?
So I think the UK financial services, banking, research culture was so much more intense in terms of the working hours, the appetite, the ambition.
Really? I would think it'd be the inverse.
Absolutely. Because financial markets are always open for the UK employees, you come into Asia and you leave with the US, and then in the middle you have the European markets. You're just always on, and there's always something to be doing. Whereas in the US, come 4:30, the world is closed. And also the interesting thing there is very, very few people actually live in Manhattan. Everyone in London who works there works in London. So they'll go for drinks after, there'll be things going on, there'll be lots of dinners. In New York, that just wasn't the case. They all live upstate, or they live in, they live on that train that comes into Grand Central, Westchester, etc. And so I found the working culture was quite masochistic in the sense that people never take holidays and they're always doing things. But I actually had a British boss. I was British with only 2 Brits in the whole department.
Yeah.
I came and went as I left, basically, as long as I always did my work. So there was never a problem with, back to the point about be the boss that you want to have. It was a very, very simple relationship. He asked, he said jump, I jumped. But if he didn't say it, I wouldn't. It's my own ambition was taking me places and was doing things. So, I probably worked 50, 60 hours, but I would come in at 8:30. In London, if you weren't at your desk at 7, then the head of the research department would be walking around taking numbers. It was a completely different type of approach.
Is that because of the boss though, and the team you were in, as opposed to the work culture of the city? Do you not think, or was that representative? Were you in a microcosm of the way it was everywhere in New York or London at that time?
Well, I think so maybe it's, I can't speak to all. I wasn't in investment banking, right? So people think about banks, they think about investment bankers, they think about M&A, they think about deals. Like markets is a very different part of the bank. It's constant, right? There's always things to respond to, but the market always opens the next day and it always closes that day. Whereas, deals get done quickly. So the people, that kind of brutalist 25 hours, type days, go home at 3 a.m., come back to the office at 9, that never happened because I was never working on deals. So that's just one different point. The other one was, it's all about who's your manager in research.
Yeah, sure.
Because some managers want, and this is a great line given to me in my interview actually at the bank. I said, what makes a good analyst to the deputy director of research? And she said, well, I don't give an F what you're good at, just be the best at something. Yeah. I think that's actually a really good thing from 100%. A career perspective.
Yeah.
You don't need to be everything to everyone, but know what you're good at and be really, really, really good at it. And then make sure you're working on other areas.
Yeah, great advice.
That's also comes out, by the way, back to the point about the bosses, which is for some people, and I think probably maybe slightly meanly, the less intellectually capable, creative, it was all about industry. It was about working their absolute socks off because it was the volume of information. It was the amount of things they were doing. It's the amount of touch points with clients. It was the availability that was their real selling point. And, I say that probably slightly arrogantly, but, for us, it was about the quality of our work. It was about the ideas that we were saying. It was about that stuff. And they speak for themselves, a lot of it. And so actually, I think that plays a part of it. If you're in a team where they see success as being putting in the hardest yards, as opposed to the best quality of work, it can get a very different experience for you.
Pre-April 2020, okay, what would you say the main milestones in your career were that took you on the path to setting up BeZero in early 2020?
I think starting in the European Parliament, and I've got all these random pieces of paper in a memory box somewhere with like my theories of basically environmental capitalism. Like how do you create an economy that actually values the environment? That's kind of what I was obsessed with. And I felt actually that my godfather and the Greens at that period were all about very uneconomic ideas for environmental change. So a lot of the founding idea came about. It's like, well, capitalism, whatever, it's got its problems, and yes, there are better ways of doing it, but I can't change everything all at once all the time. Like, let's pick off what stuff we can chew. And having an economic philosophy was really the thing that I felt was missing from the green movement, and I still think, to a large point is. Yeah, and so I think, my first milestone, I treat myself in a very peculiar way, but like it was, can I get a sense of what governs the body politic? Can I get a sense of, how do people think? How decisions made? How is influence created? I'd like to say I had this master plan about going back into the green economy. And then in finance, it was all about the message of the markets. It was the psychology of the markets that I spent a lot of time doing. And so the common thread between both the political side and the financial side was the psychology of behavior, of people, of what motivates people. And a friend of mine who I was just on holiday with, he's a musician in a band called Jungle, and he was doing these big world tours. And he says to me, we were in Japan watching the rugby, and he's like, how do I make my tours more environmentally friendly? And I've no idea why, but that's the question that basically created a kind of like thunderbolt through my head of all these years of experience in doing these things. And it's all about the climate economy, and here's 50 million business ideas. And he didn't know what I was talking about by the end of the conversation. But in a mean way, I just was like in my completely own world of thinking. Yeah. And then I basically spent the next week just writing. Like I wrote like books of just ideas down of just stuff, and called my business partner from Japan on my mobile and basically said, I've got it. I hadn't worked with him for 2 years. He was in London.
I'm assuming this was the Rugby World Cup, was it? You were on a lads holiday and you were doing business ideas. That's commitment.
I'm not very laddie, but yes, essentially it was two friends drinking an awful lot of Guinness and like traveling around and going to like weird onsens. Trying to hide my tattoo, and then me talking about whatever. It's because, to answer your question, I was really coming to the end of that journey in financial markets. The next step up in that is really to be a careerist, which means like a particular way of moving towards managing director. I wasn't up for it, and I'll be honest, I wanted to take some time out, move to Italy, and write a TV show about football referees. That was my plan.
Really?
And then the idea absolutely.
That's a bit of a curveball I wasn't expecting. Are you a referee, Tommy?
No, but anyway, I'll just tell you a little hint of it because But basically, the football referee is the only person in the entire stadium that the game couldn't happen without, and it's the least explored and part of the kind of footballing and social culture narrative, but also is an absolute goldmine for comedy because referees are absolute oddballs. And, so there's all kinds of questions. So I wanted to write a mockumentary called Whistleblowers, where whistleblowers would tell the story of, they would whistleblow on being a whistleblower. And it's just stuff like, anyway, so I had this whole thing mapped out. I would have a year off. I'd been exhausted. And then this idea for the green business came along. And
Sorry, Tommy. Before we move on, I think that's a great idea, by the way, and I'm really keen for you to keep me posted on that. Because if you do manage to do that, I will happily pay to go and see it, or will watch it or whatever. I don't know. It's a very unexplored vocation, I think, isn't it? You know what I mean? We don't know much about referees.
No, just two comments on that though, just to sort of highlight the peculiarity of them. One, where do referees go to drink after a game? I just love to know what they talk about.
They sit in their room, I suppose. Yeah.
No, they do. You go to the Dog and Whistle or some sort of pub like this, and then the other one is like at half time they always walk off the pitch talking to the linesman. Now, an even better one, linesman.
Their only mate. yeah.
It's brilliant. I'd be playing football in some like quite aggy league in North London, and then people kind of like really quite aggressive on a 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, shouting things to the linesman because they're given the decision of the way, which you wouldn't say to your worst enemy. And then, I'm thinking, what makes you want to come out at 9:30 to be screamed at by abusive people in their late 20s for about £20 an hour? These people are just brilliant.
Yeah, they're heroes. So as you were saying, moving on from the referee stuff.
Yeah, so I can give you the official pitch. So look, why the thesis for BeZero at the time was really this confluence of three trends. It was that financial markets, 2019, financial markets were obsessed with this idea of ESG. And I used to do this thing called fund flow analysis, which looked at where people were putting their money, and where people put their money is a really good indicator of what's going on in the world and risk, etc. And it was clear that ESG as a theme was becoming this mega trend. And, there's all the BlackRock stuff about this. And why is because there was a demographic shift between boomers and millennials. And boomers' capital was much more focused on stuff like dividends, stuff like security, but millennial capital wanted to be a bit more impact orientated.
Yeah.
And so as I looked at ESG solutions in the marketplace, from a financial perspective, they were very limited. But from an economic perspective, like an actual industry perspective, it was like the tidal wave of interest coming to actually a tiny subsector of an economy, which needed to become like, a huge part, like a mainstay of the economy. So there was this disconnect, which was just absolutely, huge. Secular, essentially, is the word you'd use it.
Yeah,
Then there were two other things. Firstly, there was this big shift in the politics. So climate change was now seen, and at the time there was Trump and a few other things, but it's seen as consensus, right? Not only change is consensus, but dealing with it is consensus. In most elections, it's typically, or hopefully it will continue to be in the UK, it's typically seen as not something that's that debated, and it's actually something that's very, very consensus. The only needle in the side is cost of living stuff, which is a bit more of a recent thing.
Yeah, sure.
And so there's the political consensus. There was this huge tidal wave of financial interest, which is the money that will pay for it all. And the third bit was that you were starting to see the actual economic impact of stuff like forest fires destroying one of the biggest utilities in California, or large parts of Australia being on fire. And these obviously is getting worse and worse in Europe these days. But 9 out of 10 of the biggest migration events were climate change related. So whether it's flooding or fires or whatever. And so you're seeing this kind of huge confluence of activities. And I just really felt that it was the time to go and try to put my money, limited, savings that I had in terms of investing in a business, but also put my skills behind the agenda that I most believed in. And I think that this is still a pitch for people that come and work here. It's like the biggest climate activists, in my opinion, are those people that actually vote with their careers, because that's really where you're putting the day in, day out activity. It's not, it's all very well campaigning, but, my pitch internally is they're a data team. They're arguing about the validity of some sort of forest in South America and the finer points of this or this trend. It's like, for me, that's 1,000 times more climate activist than stopping traffic in a street. Because you're actually trying to do the actual work, which creates an economic solution, which creates a trend.
Talk us, how did it actually come about? Who did you set up the firm with? And what is your raison d'etre?
Came about from this spontaneous moment in Japan when my friend asked me about carbon neutral touring, and then very quickly became a conversation with my very close friend Seb Cross, who's my co-founder, who I called up, and I'd always said to myself, if there's there's one person that I was going to set up a business with. He's the smartest person I knew, so I would want to go and do it with him. And then actually, there was a friend in New York who worked at one of the big tech companies. And there was actually a Welsh guy that we met, believe it or not, in the smoking area at a match in Japan. But very quickly, those two, for various reasons, didn't continue on the journey. And so, you know, we came back. I actually resigned the week before COVID happened. And so I didn't sort of resign into COVID and the isolation. I resigned just before it. And then I moved back on basically like a UN flight in April from New York with me and like 20 other people. And I remember the air hostesses could only give us bottled water. That was the only thing they were allowed to give us for like the whole flight back from New York. And then came back to London, moved back. And we basically just started spending about 6 months just trying to figure out what we thought. What was the view? How did it all work? Which of the areas we were most interested in? We didn't have that journey where it was like, I want to do this really specific thing, and that's what I'm going to get a business around. It was very much more intellectually curious than that. Not that that's not intellectually curious, but it was the foundation was, how do I understand climate transition? There's really the liability side, which is how much impact am I making? How do I calculate that? How do I have a strategy to reduce that? Then there's the asset side of it, which is, what are all the solutions, the new industries, the types of markets that are going to be needed to service that reduction journey? And it was really about figuring that kind of both sides of that balance sheet out. In the meantime, we were bootstrapped, so we didn't have any external investment. We span up a footprinting consultancy. And so the name BeZero makes a lot more sense if we do carbon footprints. It makes much less sense as a carbon ratings agency. But that's why it's called BeZero. Very early 2022 to the end of 2022, we basically ran a full board net zero consultancy, worked with about 80 clients, really proud to work in lots of very interesting consumer goods products, particularly focused on life cycle assessments, which means that you're assessing the impact of a good from essentially from the ground all the way through to the end of its life, and try to work with various organizations to reduce it. At the same time, my business partner had been completely obsessed with this idea of what is a carbon credit, and isn't it just a financial contract, and isn't it what is this market? And he used to work in the biggest market of all, which is the bond market. I used to do like multi-asset strategy. So both of us love talking about this type of thing, and it's all about getting capital investment into this space. And so like our interest, I'm not saying our interest wasn't on the footprinting side, but our real passion was this intersection between capital markets and environmental assets, and the start of this big kind of journey there. And we basically used the footprinting side to spend on the R&D of the ratings idea. And then, I remember we wrote this thing, the first of its kind sort of thing called the white paper on carbon ratings. I think it's very funny because I used to work in UK politics, right? And so anyone that works in UK politics knows what a white paper is, but have American companies calling their things white papers. Like, well, you probably didn't respond to white papers when you were 24, so there's no reason why you should be calling it a white paper today. But that's just an inside joke for anyone in the climate space. But basically, we got called up by Goldman Sachs and Citi the day we put this out, and like basically summoned to their offices and said, like, what is this? What are you doing? And so it was like pushing on a completely open door, but it was all about this key challenge, which I come on to explain. Carbon credits are treated typically like a commodity, in that every carbon credit represents 1 ton of avoided or removed emissions. And you call it carbon, but really CO2 equivalents. So it can be methane, it can be nitric oxide.
Who is responsible for measuring that, for making sure that 1 ton equals 1 credit?
That's essentially the entirety. That's like the North Star of my business.
There's no uniformity, basically, is what you're saying. There's no transparency or uniformity.
It's very difficult to guarantee that every instrument is exactly a ton of avoided or removed carbon. And I don't think it's even desirable, because you don't tend to have scaled financial markets other than physically delivered commodities, i.e. if you put an order to me to order 10 tons of coffee beans, you or someone at the end of the value chain is going to get delivery of 10 tons. And they could count every bean if they were so inclined. The problem with carbon is it's not physically delivered. So it's really hard to know that it's exactly a ton. And the other thing is it's not financially settled. So a financial instrument, like a bond, is financially settled. So at the end of it, you basically either pay back your debt or you don't, right? And so you have this weird thing, which is not that, it's not this, but it's being treated like a commodity. And the very simple thing is you have a project that says, I've got this intervention. I want to save a forest from deforestation. I want to plant and restore a mangrove. I want to build this carbon capture scheme, or I want to pay for cook stoves to be used in rural communities which use indoor charcoal fires, which can be very noxious and particularly bad problems for health of women and babies. And, I want to make these big interventions. And if I can show that revenue from selling carbon credits would make this project essentially work, because it would plug the funding gap, then I can issue credits against it. And then they have to follow methodologies, which are set by these bodies called standard bodies, who say, okay, if you want to issue credits for a forestry project of a certain type, you have to follow this exam paper. And if you pass the exam paper as approved by them and by third-party verifiers, every single unit that you issue will be equivalent to 1 ton. Now, that's how the market had operated for like 20 years. And we basically came along, and take you back to where we were in 2022. We were doing this consultancy, and we were budding up this idea.
Yeah.
We were like, well, the big idea, as far as we're concerned, was that quality wasn't binary. That the quality of this instrument wasn't necessarily guaranteed to be a ton. And that's equivalent to a financial rating type research offering, which is a very, very, very valuable part of how people assess risk in financial markets, particularly in bond markets, but other types of markets as well. And that could be the secret sauce, in more specific terms, a risk-based approach to assessing quality, or a probabilistic approach to the distribution of quality, would be a much more scalable solution to how we actually scale capital into the carbon markets and all these amazing interventions, these projects, than the current system that they had. Long story short, we basically were kind of courted by a very lovely VC called Illuminate Financial, who spent very patiently about 3 or 4 months with Seb and I arguing that we should sort of focus on this rating agency and not do all the other things that we were doing. And we were like, oh, we do 6 things. Of course we do 6 things, because every company should be doing 6 things. They're like, no, just do 1, maybe just focus on 1. And then we went on this journey of like, should we go on this kind of VC scale up mission, or should we basically just stick to doing some nice consultancy and going home at 6 p.m?
Yeah.
And I think we've both felt, why not? Like it
push it as far as
let's go hard, basically, because we're both young.
Yeah, why not?
We were both childless, both very passionate, and we thought might as well. And then we were very, very lucky. I mean, I was seriously lucky, because we basically we did a seed, an A, and then a B within about 14 months. We raised about $75 million, but at the same time, basically went from a 30-person, predominantly footprinting consultancy, to building a product from scratch, launching a rating agency as a software solution, and essentially then scaling from about repurposing a lot of those people, but scaling from about 30 to like where we are today, 150, and just entering our second year of trading, and have nearly 100 clients worldwide, and lots of what we can talk about the business today. But that was really came down to this one decision when we were sort of sitting having a virtual beer with each other. Like, do we want to go on this journey? Now, you never know where that's going to lend. You never, lots of people don't get the funding benefits, don't get to keep going. So, it was obviously a big gamble, but it really came down to that one moment of what kind of company do you want to be? And then the funding is it's the oil for the engine, sorry to use a non-climate metaphor, but it is the thing that keeps you going.
Look, there was loads to unpack there, Tommy. How did you maintain the culture that you and the co-founders had built into the company to build the company that you wanted to build?
At the very start of the program, you said, what makes good leadership? Yeah. And I think now, confronted with the company that I have, it's a very different type of leadership to the one that I embarked upon the company with, and as a person that I was. And to your point about maintaining cultural cohesion, that is absolutely the main challenge that we face right now. Of course, there's competitive pressures. Of course, there's there's work stuff. But because it's a new industry and new category, so many people here are doing jobs that never existed before, are so critical to what we do. Key man risk here, or key person risk is, it's about half our staff, and that's being like conservative about the amount of impact that these people have for the business. And so actually, it is a big challenge, and it's not something that I'd say that we did particularly amazingly. We've had very low attrition rates, but we scale very quickly, and a lot of people Actually, the average tenure now is about 1 year, so it's not too bad. But this next year will really be the telling of, can we get the cultural recipe correct? It's a big challenge, and it's something that preoccupies me a lot. And what I'd say for that period of scaling was, sheer bloody mindedness, really, of, no one's inviting you into this space. No one, you're trying to create a paradigm, which is this kind of financial markets type approach to assessing risk for these environmental assets, which upsets a lot of people, which really tops apple cart for certain communities that require, philanthropic funding. We're basically saying that this shouldn't be philanthropically funded. It should be financially funded, capital markets based. And then you've got other people who were in the market already who were like, well, of course, 1 ton is 1 ton. Who are you to tell me that it's not? All these people we were basically upsetting and having to essentially impose ourselves into the debate and then weather the storm of what that did. So there was a lot of trying to be resilient. And then, we were very lucky to get a lot of talent, and they were committed to the cause, and they saw the passion, and they saw the hard work of everyone, and the money and the clients kept kind of coming in. And that's obviously a big validation. But I think now we get into our second year as a business. Actually, it needs to be much more self-reflective, a bit more listening based. And I think the other bit to it is not be afraid to say what we aren't. I think that's actually something that people, you can kind of chase your tail on. We're not a 9-to-5 culture. For example, we've just done this very large employee satisfaction survey, 300 questions, and we're just processing the results. But it was very clear that, there's lots of positives and there are some things that we need to work on culturally. It's been an absolutely wild ride to get to where we've got to. You need to take that opportunity, and you need to sort of build up some cultural debt in the process. But this is the time to really do less of certain things and pay it back to the staff who've got you there. It's an interesting question. It's not a straightforward answer, but it's not a straightforward problem.
No, of course. You guys obviously scaled quickly, but you also acquired a lot of clients quickly. I wanted to ask you about that. How committed are corporations, governments, organizations? Because I'm hearing this term greenwashing quite a lot. A lot of corporations get a lot of criticism. They're not really committed. They just engage a company like you, but they're not really walking the walk. What do you think about that? And what have you seen since you've been in this marketplace, Tommy?
It's funny, you start with greenwashing. There's a whole lexicon of terms prefixed with the word green have emerged now for green hushing and green, all these sort of things for how people are behaving. My view is not Condidian. It's not the best of all worlds, the best of all times, but it is optimistic. And I do think that, generally speaking, there are incredible amounts of well-meaning people in all kinds and manners of corporates, including many of the worst polluters, who are absolutely firebrand passionate about trying to figure out a way of responding to their emissions and putting themselves on the journey to decarbonize their services and products. I'm filled an industry with passionate and inspiring people genuinely trying to do that. However, it's a big challenge. And I think probably the cognitive dissonance comes about when people set these big targets, I'm going to be net zero by 2040, by 2050, and then start going into the weeds of it and realizing that it's a horizontal problem. It's not like, oh, if I just change this one thing over here, then it would all be fine. It's everything about the way that entity operates, which is it's a very challenging issue. It's fundamentally reappraising their supply chains. It could even be fundamentally appraising the way that they actually behave as an organization and what they actually sell and how they sell it and the markets they operate in. And so that cross-cutting nature of it is probably the thing that people really are commenting on negatively when it comes to stuff like greenwashing, because there's a disconnect between the reality of that complexity and the ambition of what people are trying to do. However, I would push back on that cynicism and say, you've got to start with manifesting where you want to get to and then start dealing with the reality of getting there. That's a much better way than not talking about getting there. That's the alternative. So, I think that's kind of where I see this at a really meta perspective. At a granular perspective, you probably have 3 categories. You have people who are just figuring out what they want to do. Essentially they're just saying, what's my problem? How do I deal with it? How big is it? That's kind of footprinting, liability assessment, liability management side. And then you have kind of 2 categories of people who are taking action. You have those that are really today trying to figure out absolutely from top to bottom, what can they do better and how can they decarbonize their activities, and potentially also invest in carbon credits and other types of compensatory instruments to support those emissions which are hard to abate. And then you have the ones that are seeing it as they'll go with the flow, but they're not necessarily want to be the leader. And this is particularly interesting for the use of carbon credits in ameliorating their emissions. It's kind of virtue signaling. And so if you buy credits and you tell everyone about it, then you're trying to say, look, I'm doing something good about this.
Yeah.
But if the instruments are bad, then it's like doubly bad, because not only are you polluting, you're also telling people that you're buying things for good reasons which are bad. So it's like -2. There are two big debates for people using carbon credits, which is more and what I operate in. On the supply side, it's how do I understand the quality of these things? And on the demand side, it's how do I use them to make a net zero claim, essentially. And at the highest level, it's all about paying for your emissions. So you don't even need to make a claim, really. You're just starting to use these things as a way of paying, setting a price for what you pollute. But at a very specific thing, it's like, okay, well, I've adhered to this thing called science-based targeting, or I've adhered to these decarbonization strategies. You know, if I buy these things, is it going to make me in accordance with them, or can I talk about it with my customers? You know, there was this trend for a few years called, you know, carbon neutral everything, where everything you saw in the supermarkets had a carbon neutral label on it. You know, there's a lot of pushback on that now. And then on the supply side, it's the complexity of really trying to understand very complicated sources of emissions, whether it's nature-based or engineered, and the projects that are intervening to either reduce or remove them. And, you know, and can we actually assess that activity as accurately as possible? And as I said to you at the beginning, should you be using a binary paradigm that you either do or don't pass this test, or should you be using more of a distributional paradigm where, you know, as long as you hit these standards, above and beyond that, it's going to be a distribution, and that's actually how people generally assess risk. What that means for day-to-day people is, should I buy these things or not, basically? Yeah. And then for the general masses, it's, should I have a net zero strategy or not? And I think a lot of people are.
Fantastic. So cause for optimism then, I suppose, Tommy, yeah?
Like the green backlash right now. There's a lot of cynicism with the granular workings of different markets, the efficacy of corporate action at a very global level, basically the cost of living and the inflation crisis that's permeated from various sources, that people think, well, maybe we've gone too hard, too quickly, and there's other things that we have to figure out. But I think you do need to be optimistic. I think it's very important that you turn up every day and say, look, you know, I'm trying to make this thing better, and that you believe that other people in this space are also trying to do that. Because there's a lot of, it's quite internecine at times, the way in which people in the climate or community can operate. And it's, for me, it's like splitting hairs. Like, you fundamentally agree about 99% of things. Why are you vehemently disagreeing about the 1%? So I'm optimistic about the intention of actors in this space, whether it's corporates through to companies that actually operate in it. And I'm optimistic about the speed at which we're trying to respond and innovate to deal with it. But I am pessimistic that the reality and the harshness of current conditions and for many countries precludes them from taking those actions at the speed at which we'd most like, which is all the more reason why you need to have jobs and growth to support it, right?
Brilliant. Look, Tommy, there's so many directions we could go in here. I think you've covered all the things I wanted to talk about in relation to in relation to BeZero and your industry. A couple of things we always ask our guests: what tech innovation are you most excited about, and what tech innovations have you benefited from since you've set up the company?
I think the application of what had previously been mostly academic geospatial and Earth observation techniques to sort of the general economy, that's really exciting. I think looking at the theory of financial assets and applying it to environmental activities is also really exciting. It's that translates to stuff like data systems, how you think about big data, machine learning tools, etc., as well as just the conception of the more sort of human innovation side of climate tech in terms of risk models. So those are probably the areas that I'm most excited about. And then just the innovation of solutions.
What about AI? I know you guys use AI.
We do use some AI. We're increasingly looking at how best to use it. My shorthand for AI at the moment is it's really machine learning. AI hasn't really taken off its scale yet, but there is quite a lot of opportunity for how you do research. And so how you synthesize information, how you make it quicker for the analysts to do their job, but also how you can do it to train models against environmental, sort of nature-based trends. So you can look at complex ecosystems and you can train data based on prior trends and to observe what's going on in real time. So those are the two bigger applications. To quote a very senior software developer at a very big AI company, it is often just a gigantic if statement, which is me trolling the entire AI community. But there's a lot more to it than that in the future. And it's now about figuring out what can actually provide value to us. Because ultimately, it's a risk-based analysis of a trend. There's lots of areas which will be AI relevant, and there's lots of areas that won't be. So that's just speaking from our particular
100%. Yeah, that's really good. But I think if it's this good now, can you imagine what it's going to be like in 5-10 years? It's going to be scary, isn't it? You know, so I think that's inevitably going to impact your industry and many others as well. Wanted to ask you, looking back now, I normally ask this question, advice would you give to your 21-year-old self? But I think I want to slightly slant the question to you, Tommy, 3.5 years in nearly with the company. What advice would you give to your pre-BeZero self in terms of the journey you've been on? What would you say to that person, when you were starting on this journey?
I'd probably just return to this cultural side of it and say there is a trade-off between scale up and culture. Just be really conscious of investing in that side of it and knowing that things will fall off as you scale so quickly. Will I do things differently? Not sure. I would, but having a much better and emotional understanding of what's going on would have been very helpful. And the other one is, it's an obvious question, but like take help wherever you can get it. Because finally, just always remember people that help you on the way up.
Yeah, sure.
There is never, I hope this is true. You can ask people around me, but like, there's no one that has helped me on the way up that I'm not available for. Because it really matters, like how you are perceived and how you are, the manners that you go about your operations in are really important. Because not everyone's going to be your ally, not everyone's going to invest in you, not everyone is going to want to work for you. But if you can hold yourself, to a high standard, then you'll get a good vibe around you, which is very important. Those are the things that I probably have learned the hard way are very important.
Brilliant. That's great advice, Tommy. And I think that's a perfect way to end. Thank you for being so candid. Where can people find out about BeZero and some of the amazing work you guys are doing? And where can they find out about yourself and reach out to you?
Yeah, so BeZeroCarbon.com has a huge research offering, lots of papers on what we do. You can look at the ratings and how we do it. And for me, I don't know, you can find me walking around in Camden with my daughter in the early mornings if you're interested.
And in the bar for the World Cup watching the All Blacks, eh?
Yes, up very early watching the Rugby Championship.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tommy. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Gareth.
That was a really interesting conversation. I didn't know a great deal about climate science and related finance and policy, but Tommy brilliantly explained this nascent industry of carbon net zero solutions. What I really enjoyed today was Tommy talking about how they scaled, particularly hiring people to do jobs that, in Tommy's words, nobody has ever heard of. I'm sure many entrepreneurs and business leaders can relate to this. BeZero Carbon went from a small founding team to 150 staff in a little over 2 years. That is incredible growth. How on earth do you manage that? And how do you manage performance and expectations of that level of staff in a like I said, in a very nascent industry where the jobs are, there's nothing really to benchmark against? Essentially, Tommy was saying that they relied on good old-fashioned common sense and playing it by ear, but it was really fascinating to listen to him talk through that and talking through how they retained the culture in accordance with the DNA of the founders and the original purpose that was communicated by Tommy himself whilst on holiday in Japan 4 years ago when BeZero was at an embryonic stage. Really like Tommy's description of greenwashing, the shift from climate awareness to climate action, and how committed businesses are. I have no doubt that BeZero will go from strength to strength in alignment with the inevitable rise of this industry and related industries. It really was a fascinating conversation. I loved it. If you found this episode valuable and thought-provoking, we would really appreciate it if you could quite simply click the subscribe button and possibly even leave a review. This helps us to spread the word and reach a wider audience so that we can make a bigger impact and bring you the best guests possible. Thank you so much for downloading. Hello, Adam. So I'll just run through and re-record these two sentences. I'll do a couple of times each, a few times each. So hopefully we can nail it with one of them. I'll try and do it in different sort of styles, if you like, just to see if we can get there. So here we go. So here's the first one, which is fast forward 4 years, blah, blah, blah. So I'll crack on with that now. Fast forward 4 years, and they've now scaled to 150 people and are really making a difference in this nascent industry as a global carbon ratings agency. Try it again. Fast forward 4 years, and they've now scaled to 150 people and are really making a difference in this nascent industry as a global carbon ratings agency. Fast forward 4 years, and they have now scaled to 150 staff, and they are really making a difference in this nascent industry as a global carbon ratings agency. I think the last one was probably the rolled off the best, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So let's do the next one. BeZero went from a bunch to I think she's done that. A bunch of founders and skeleton staff, 250 in a little over 2 years. That's BeZero went from. Oh, hang on. BeZero went from. Oh God, that doesn't make sense. I have to redo this sentence. BeZero went from a small collective of founders and skeleton staff to 150 staff in a little over 2 years. That's incredible growth. I don't know what's going to work here. BeZero went from a bunch of founders and a small support team right up to 150 staff in a little over 2 years. That is ridiculous growth. BeZero went from a founding team to over 150 staff. BeZero went from a small founding team to 150 staff in a little over 2 years. That is ridiculous growth. BeZero went from a small founding team to 150 staff in a little over 2 years. That's incredible growth. I'll try it one more time. BeZero went from a small founding team to 150 staff in a little over 2 years. That is incredible growth. Hopefully that works, Adam. Let me know if we need to do it again. I think that's everything.